Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Praminda Jacob, Associate Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this event. It's great to see so many of you gathered here. And I'm so glad that the Center for Ethics and Values has created this opportunity where 4 UMBC scholars will lead us in a debrief and dialogue about the US presidential election. The mission of the Center for Ethics and Values is to foster thoughtful, informed, and nuanced exploration of pressing ethical issues, and to bring the expertise of philosophy to bear on the complex and significant ethical issues of importance to researchers and students across the university, as well as to the broader community that UMBC serves. I was fortunate to be present at the inaugural event of the center this September, during which a panel focused on the ethics in journalism. And I'm pleased to share that some of the funds to establish the center came from the dean of our college's Big Ideas Fund. We are really fortunate that we are part of an institution like UMBC that challenges us, students, faculty, staff alike, to engage in thoughtful discussions, especially on topics about which we might hold different opinions. This is the foundation of healthy communities. Please look out for another such opportunity titled Together Beyond the Election 2024 on November 14th. That's organized by the Center for Democracy and Civic Life, where we can come together again to gain perspectives about how to make sense of the results of the election and to engage in small group dialogue. Thank you. And Jessica, the chair of the department, will introduce the speakers.
Thank you all for coming. We're delighted to have you here. So as Praminda mentioned, I'm Jessica Pfeiffer. I'm chair of the philosophy department, where the center is housed. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established on the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. And while we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that this is a small gesture, and we must take action toward the necessary work of repair. So we've already heard a bit about the mission of the center. It is to foster thoughtful, informed, and nuanced exploration of pressing ethical values. Ethical issues are everywhere. We face ethical decisions in nearly everything we do, in our work, in our research, as students, as teachers, in our families, in our friendships, in deciding where we get our news, in deciding whether to come to a public forum, in what shows to watch, in what social media to use, and in deciding how to vote. These public forums provide an opportunity for us to come together as a community, including not only the community within UMBC, but also the wider community UMBC serves, to work together to gain a deeper understanding of the serious ethical issues we face. The public forum brings together experts in ethics and values with those who face those ethical issues. The aim of today's public forum is to bring us together as a community with experts from political science and philosophy to engage in a critical discussion about elections broadly and this election in particular. I recently participated in a workshop devoted to teaching people how to communicate about difficult topics, and I came away learning 2 significant things. First, listening can be very difficult, especially when it is about things we strongly disagree with. And second, people can have good reasons to believe very different things. We no doubt have different and perhaps strongly held views about the outcomes of the various parts of the election. As we engage in discussion today, it is important to remember that we can have good reasons to believe different things. This does not mean it's all a matter of opinion, or that some reasons aren't better than others. This is what we do in philosophy. We've all had the experience of realizing at some point in our lives that we thought we had a good reason to believe something that we later realize was not a good reason, or that there are better reasons to believe something else. My hope for today is that we all gain a deeper understanding of the election, of the views of those who disagree with us, and also by doing so to gain a deeper critical understanding of our own beliefs and values. We all have a lot to learn from one another. I learn things from my students every class. It is important that we listen to views that are different from our own, not only so that we can understand our fellow human beings, but also to help us think critically about our own beliefs and values. This does not mean we ought not stand up for the things we believe in, but we can only learn from one another if we listen to each other and engage in respectful discourse. So now I want to thank those who have helped make today's event possible, and many thanks to our co-sponsors, especially to the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, who have helped make our events this year possible, to the Drescher Center for the Humanities, to the Center for Social Science Scholarship, to the Center for Democracy and Civic Life, the Department of Political Science, and the new Institute of Politics. Thanks also to Rebecca Lee, and a special thanks to Vanessa Capuano, without whom nothing the center does would be possible. We hope you will join us at our future events, all at 7 p.m. at this location. On February 27, we will have a discussion of neuroscience, free will, and moral responsibility with a dialogue between neuroscientists, philosophers, and legal scholars. On April 8, there will be a discussion of the ethics of artificial intelligence, featuring one of the architects of ethical AI at Salesforce, a specialist in neurodiversity and AI, in conversation with a philosopher who specializes in AI. And on May 8th, we will have our annual Evelyn Barker Memorial Lecture featuring Samuel Scheffler speaking about existential catastrophe and the love of humanity. For more about these events, please visit us at ethics.umbc.edu, and you can also find them on the back of the piece of paper that you can use to ask questions. And now let me introduce our panelists. The event today features 3 UMBC faculty who are experts in different aspects of politics, 2 of whom are political scientists, Professor Malia Cromer and Professor Carolyn Forestieri, and 1, a philosopher, Professor Michael Nance. Malia Cromer is the inaugural director of UMBC's new Institute of Politics and associate professor of political science. She is a widely recognized expert on Maryland politics and public opinion polling, having founded the Goucher College Poll, which she ran until coming to UMBC this fall. Her opinion writing has appeared in Politico magazine, CNN, The Washington Post, The Hill, The Baltimore Banner, Maryland Matters, and The Baltimore Sun. She is a frequent guest on state and local public affairs programs like WYPR's Midday with Tom Hall, WBAL's TV 11 TV Hill, and MPT's State Circle, among others. She is the author of Blue State Republican, How Larry Hogan Won, Where Republicans Lose, and Lessons for a Future GOP, and her work has appeared in major journals in her field. Carolyn Forestieri is professor of political science. Her research focuses on comparative politics, Western Europe, institutions, and research methodology. She is the author of Beginning Research in Political Science with Oxford University Press and co-editor of the 2018 publication of Politica in Italia. And her work in comparative politics has been published in top journals in her field. She is also widely recognized for her teaching. She won the Political Science Department's Teacher of the Year Award 7 times. In 2019, she was named UMBC's Presidential Teaching Professor, and in 2022, she was selected by UMBC's Alumni Association for the Outstanding Faculty Award. Michael Nance is Associate Professor of Philosophy at UMBC. He has also been an Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. He writes on German social and political philosophy, especially post-Kantianism, and his work has appeared in leading journals and books in his field. He is currently co-translating a volume of Johann Benjamin Erhard's Writings on Revolution for Oxford University Press. And today's forum will be moderated by Whitney Schwab, who is an associate professor of philosophy and also the inaugural director of the Center for Ethics and Values. Professor Schwab specializes in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. He is the recipient of an NEH fellowship, was chosen to deliver the prestigious Gregory Vlastos Memorial Lecture, and his co-authored paper, The Birth of Belief, was recognized as one of the 10 best philosophy papers in 2019 by Philosopher's Annual. So I'll now turn this over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. The way it's going to go is we're going to have the first half of the event be a discussion among the panelists prompted by questions from me, and then we're going to pivot into the second half, which is going to be the panelists responding to questions from the audience. And there is a QR code in which you can submit the question. If you don't have it, someone near you probably will have it, but there's also flyers in the back. So you can submit your questions as the event goes on, and then we'll take a brief break if you want to submit your questions in between that period. Okay? All right, so I'm actually going to start us at a pretty general level, and I want to first ask you all, or ask, what is the purpose, or what are the purposes of elections in a democracy? So Mike, you want to get us going?
Yeah, so one purpose of elections is to legitimize the authority of political leaders. So when I teach my political philosophy class, I sort of structured around this question about like what gives people the right to tell other people what to do, which is a very natural part of our everyday life and something that we just take for granted, that there are all these authority structures where somebody has a certain kind of power over another person. But there's a basic philosophical question, which is, well, what gives you the right to tell me what to do, right? And one plausible answer to that question is we chose you and gave you the job of telling the rest of us what to do, right? And so one way of looking at elections is as having that kind of legitimizing function, right? They select officials and political leaders who then, because they've been selected through the electoral process, actually have a sort of moral right to exercise a special kind of power and authority. Yeah. So I think the legitimizing function is important. And then if enough people believe that a person or an institution has that kind of authority, then we would say in a more kind of social sciencey sense that it's legitimate, right? It's legitimate because people believe it to wield legitimate authority. Yeah.
Sure, I completely agree. We need elections to choose the people who have to take the responsibility to exercise power. Otherwise, it would be chaos and anarchy, and different contexts will develop different rules to figure out who that leader will be. Elections is one way to give popular support to a leader, but as we will see, I think as we get later into this panel, it can get very messy in the details in terms of how an election is conducted. So, I mean, if we're asking what is the purpose of an election, it's basically to choose who or who, the people or the person or people that will make the hard decisions for us. But the context of the election definitely matters. And so if we're talking, elections take place in non-democracies for certain types of things, and there'll be elections at all different levels of governance. So elections serve to legitimize the choice of a particular leader to do a particular task at its most broad level. But then I think as we get into the panel, we'll start to talk about like what is the purpose of democratic elections versus other types of elections.
Yeah, so that's a natural springboard to a follow-on question then. So if that's sort of a broad picture function of elections, then what sort of conditions need to be in place for that very process to be legitimate?
That's a very good question.
Well,
What types of processes? And I think that in the American case, I think the idea of elections, I mean, I think we have this understanding that an election, like if we were to take a choice among this group of people, like are we going to drink coffee or are we going to drink water? We have a simple choice. And I think that we just understand we go with the majority, right? And so the majority somehow has a legitimacy to it. But what if there are three choices? And what if there is a choice that's not in the majority and it's a plurality, but if you put everybody else together, they're the majority? Is that legitimate? And it depends on the rules of the game. In addition, it's important to know the context of what type of election and things like that. So, yeah, and I think in democracies, I mean, what you could say about a democracy is that the most basic definition of a democracy is that at routine intervals, the people, however defined, have a chance to reject a particular leader. And that's it. That's it. Nothing about minority rights or nothing about, at the most basic level, a democracy is just the ability, as they say, to throw the rascals out, right? So, and the electoral process is defined by every polity, whether it be a country, a state, whoever's deciding. But as we're going to see, the rules matter quite a bit in terms of who the winner is. But as long as the rules are accepted by everyone in advance, the outcome is considered legitimate, even if, and also too, democracy is about opposition consent. It's not just about having a winner, it's about the people who lose saying, okay, we lost, we're going to go home, think about this, and that at a routine interval we'll have another chance to possibly beat whoever was the winner. And really, at the most basic level, that's it. Everything else is just added on.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, I mean, I think you said this actually, but it's worth emphasizing that there's this underlying, in functioning democratic elections, there's this underlying norm of reciprocity where people agree that they're gonna abide by the outcomes, right? And that means if you win, then I'm gonna accept that, you know, that I lost and you win and you're legitimate and you have the right to rule, and vice versa, right? And I think that underlying norm of reciprocity is something that's fraying in our country, actually, and it's worth emphasizing that is one of the conditions that has to be in place for democratic elections to actually do what they're supposed to do. Right?
I think we typically, in the American case, always talk about things being free and fair. So free and fair elections are sort of that underlying principles. And by free, meaning that anybody who is of eligible age has the ability to exercise that right to vote, and by fair, meaning that all the votes are counted in a fair manner. And I think certainly we can look at some of our institutional structures, and we're going to obviously talk about that a little bit later in a comparative perspective, that there are certainly areas in which the American democracy, in terms of how we administer our elections, can fall short, and have fallen short.
What are some of the...
I think certainly one of the things that has been under scrutiny probably most recently is the Electoral College. And so there certainly is a frustration for individuals who don't believe that it's a handful of people in a handful of states should be deciding the outcome of a national election. And so that is certainly what's interesting about this time around. I say it looks like that we're going to both have the Electoral College winner is going to be the same person as the popular vote winner. And so that creates a whole other, this time it worked out the way, typically I think the people who the founders constructed this system, they wanted it to work. That we shouldn't have all these times where the Electoral College is so dramatically different from the popular vote, but we look back at the last few election cycles and that just has not been the case. And there's also the issue of the US Senate has certainly over the last year or so we've had like a lot more dialogue and conversation about like, is it fair for states with with small populations to have the same number of seats in the U.S. Senate as states with large populations. So for example, Prince George's County, Maryland has a larger population than I believe 5 other U.S. states. And so it's all about, I guess, but it's all about whether you believe that states should have, as individual entities, an equal say, and then have the House of Representatives be by population. And that is certainly up for debate.
And so how would you characterize the most important shifts or changes over the last several decades in these background conditions? Or what would you identify as the most important changes over the last, 250 years, but more realistically, like in the last several decades?
Which the background conditions of elections, or just?
Oh no, like the sort of norms of reciprocity, and then these sorts of questions that have come to the fore of whether or not, because I actually don't know. It might have always been the case that people have been complaining about each state has 2 senators. Maybe that debate goes all the way back to the late 1800s or late 1700s. But does it? Do we know?
I think that was originally a compromise among the framers of the Constitution. The fact that we have the Senate is sort of non-proportional and the House is proportional, right?
So then more specifically, like the respect for the reciprocity and oppositional acceptance of Carolyn said, oppositional consent.
Well, I'll respond to that by talking about the structure of American elections,
Please.
Okay? So we all know that we have different branches of government, right? The executive is selected by the Electoral College, which is actually an indirect method. It's not a direct method. And as we know, all of the different states have a certain number of votes, and we vote in each state. And because the race may be close in a particular state, we all know about the swing states, and it's no surprise that the 2 presidential candidates were very much present in those 7 states, or 3 really in particular, towards the end of the electoral season. And it really ignores the rest of the country because it's assumed that those countries are either going to go one way or another. So I think all of this feeds into legitimacy because people actually think that their vote doesn't count because the outcome is already predetermined in advance via the Electoral College. So I think that, and also too, in terms of legitimacy, I don't see very much in the American electoral system, quite honestly, that's straightforward. Because I think that most Americans, if you were to ask them exactly how do the electoral systems for our different institutions work, I don't know, I don't know if they would be able to tell you exactly how all of this is aggregated together and why does it take, the sensationalism of the media during the returns and, we're having the polls close at 6 here and then, or 7 here, and then we go across the country, right? So you have, the Electoral College at the national level for the president, and we've had 2 examples in recent memory, one in 2000 and one in 2016, in which the winner of the electoral contest, the Electoral College contest, was not the popular winner. And that, if you say that to anybody outside of the United States, that sounds crazy. Like, how can that be legitimate? That Gore got more votes than Bush or Hillary Clinton got more votes than Trump, and I think that challenges legitimacy. When we talk about the House, if you ever look at a map of the electoral districts of the House of Representatives, it looks like a crazy person's jigsaw puzzle because it's like these districts have been gerrymandered in such a way that it's almost unrecognizable in terms of like why these districts were aggregated in this way. And they clearly were made that way by both political parties, although one of them is a little bit more guilty than the other than this, but both parties for sure. To manufacture a particular electoral outcome. So again, so much so that most of the House is determined the day before. We know how it's going to go, and we're just looking at a handful of seats that might flip with just small fluctuations of the vote percentage. And I think that in the eyes of the American population that doesn't study electoral systems, it's absolutely not straightforward. And then we get to the Senate. And how is the Senate selected? Well, I mean, if we were to just go outside and ask Americans, how is the Senate selected, that it's only a third of them every single electoral contest. And also, going back to the House, we re-elect the House every 2 years we go through this, right? Now, talking about the Senate, when we brought up this malapportionment, as it's called, you know, California, with its 5th largest economy in the entire world, gets the same Senate representation as, I'm going to be hyperbolic, as, say, Wyoming with 17 people. I mean, I'm being hyperbolic. No, I don't know. Okay, it's like 800,000, but less than 1 million people. So it's like, it's the same. And I think that when you look at the composition of the Senate and also what the Senate does, the Senate is in charge of the judicial appointments for the Supreme Court, for the Fed. It's very important. And so when Americans look at their own electoral system, there's not a lot, quite honestly, in my mind, that is straightforward.
Yeah.
You know, I think what's really interesting at that point is we look at one of the most straightforward things that people really sort of hold up is this idea of the direct democracy. We're going to put something on the ballot, and then the voter is going to directly vote for it. We're going to circumvent all of this sort of like voting for representative to actually vote for it. And I look at Baltimore City, and I think a lot about their ballot process, about this ballot initiative process. If you look, if anybody here is a Baltimore City voter, you got your ballot, yeah, and you got a ton of different ballot questions on it. In some ways, isn't this a fantastic exercise of American democracy, that you get to vote directly on things like the size of the city council, on term limits, and all these things? Except for you have to ask yourself, you have to take a step back and wonder how exactly somebody was able to get enough signed petitions to get that on the ballot. And this is where the idea of fairness sort of comes into play. I think originally, when a lot of these sort of direct democracy initiatives came, that you really hoped that sort of advocacy organizations, the people who care deeply about an issue, would be able to petition the people directly and get that issue on the ballot, circumvent any problems that they might have with their elected officials. But really what has happened in Baltimore City, the most notable ones are a direct result of moneyed interests being able to pay canvassers to go out and get things on the ballot. So Baltimore City voters recently rejected shrinking down their city council, which on this last election. But that was not. That was certainly, to me, a credit to the activists who got behind it, because that is typically not what happens. Things that get on the ballot typically pass because people will go, that it's always the last thing you do. You vote for the president, you vote for the other top of the ticket, then you start to go on down the line. And by the time you get down to the ballot initiative questions that are really, really important, you're tired of reading it. And you start to click yes and click yes and click yes. So credit where it's due for the activists who actually defeated the initiative to shrink the city council. But sometimes simple, to me, isn't always necessarily better. So it's easier to understand, but I'm not sure if I'm not sure if our kind of exercise in direct democracy has given us the sort of beautiful fruits of democracy that we thought would happen.
It's interesting too. I wonder how many people, when they go to vote, know that they're going to be asked a series of questions at the end. I know even though all of this information is generally online, and you may have even received sample ballots in the mail by nonpartisan organizations hoping to disseminate good information, but sometimes you may get into that ballot box and you see one of these initiatives and you think, well, should I vote for a $5 million bond to build, playgrounds at this school or something like that? Yeah. And you don't really know how to answer, and we may have people answering questions without really understanding what they are.
And I don't want to be I'm not a huge critic of direct democracy, by the way. I just think that there can be some serious flaws in the system, that it's not always, even though it seems simple and it seems like a good idea, that oftentimes you have to really, I think, meet voters where they're at, and they're coming into the ballot box. Oftentimes, a lot of people had just thought about that issue by a pamphlet on their way in or by reading the question itself. And I think oftentimes these are really important decisions that sometimes I think need a little bit more time to think about than just in the moment at the box.
And I think the example also speaks to a sort of very general thing, which is that electoral democracy is more democratic if you have more background socioeconomic equality, right? I mean, these things are related to each other. So just because everybody has the same right to vote definitely does not mean in a society that has vast inequalities of wealth like ours, right? It does not mean that everybody actually has equal political power, right? And so your example of like being able to get things on the ballot is a special case of really something that's much more general, right?
Great, so I think there's a natural follow-up to each contribution. So, I mean, I think sometimes it's easier to to put in relief, to understand what you're looking at if you can put it in relief against something else. So what could be or would be an alternative to what we have? What do they have elsewhere that...
Okay, this is my favorite topic of all time. So you've just asked me my dream question. Okay, so I'm going to share with you that I did a study abroad program in 1992, and I went to Italy. And I ended up taking a political science class without understanding at all what political science was all about. And I learned that they had 50 political parties in the Italian context, 50. And I mean, it was just like, you know, the professor was listing off all of these different ideologies and he placed them on a line. And I naively thought, don't most countries have Democrats and Republicans? I mean, I was young, and then I learned about ideology and I learned about electoral systems, and I learned that they use a system of proportionality. And also too, when many countries go to vote, especially, and also we're talking about democracies now, right? And we have to understand, we are very lucky to live in a democracy, actually. Democracy is in the minority. Many people around the world right now are actually living in some form of semi-democracy or autocracy. So democracy is a bit precious in the sense that not many people globally get to enjoy it. So when I did this program and I learned about the different types of electoral systems, and I read this quote that has stayed with me my entire career, and that is, there are different ways of counting votes, so there are different ways of making votes count. And let that sink in for a minute. There are different ways of counting votes, so there are different ways of making votes count. And there are countries that use proportionality, and what does that mean? That means when they go to vote, first of all, they may not be voting for a president. We get into comparative politics a little bit here. Some countries don't have a president. They have a prime minister, and they have a parliamentary system. And when they go to vote, they use parties. They get a list of all these different parties, and they choose the party. And let's say party A receives 20% of the vote, they're going to get 20% of the seats in the legislature, and so forth and so on. Usually in those contexts, you don't get a majority party. Why? Because if you know that so many parties can run, if you have a sense that 5, 6, 7% of your population might agree with you on a particular issue or a particular ideology, you're going to form a political party. It gives a lot of space for different actors to come in and form institutional parties. And so then these parties have to then, what happens after the election, and who's the winner? Well, the winner, sometimes they call it the biggest party, but then really what happens is the parties have to get together and form a coalition, and that coalition then has a leader. That leader may become the prime minister that is voted within the parliament. And so, you know, it's a whole different conception of how to organize political power in different types of democracies. And so when the American context is truly unique, truly, in terms of the electoral college first for the executive, and then for the different methods for the House and the Senate and the way that they're chosen. And then we also have our judiciary that is, you know, confirmed by our Senate and so forth and so on. But, you know, the idea that every single country in the world has a different type of system, because you have to know what is the system? Is it majoritarianism like ours? Like we vote in a district, we only have one winner per district. That sort of encourages two parties, because otherwise, if you have more parties, you've heard of the split vote, right? If you have, you know, the wasted vote, which is a terrible way to say it, to say like a third party candidate comes in and, you know, can split the vote between the two, and now we don't get a majority. But in a proportional system, people have many more choices, and maybe they can choose a choice that is much more aligned with their true ideological preferences, and they don't have to think strategically about it. And then afterwards, there's a coalition building process. In some countries, however, that process can take up to a year, depending on what's going on within the different parties. I mean, they may agree to collaborate before they go to an election, and then as soon as, in the Italian context, this happens all the time. Oh, we'll be friends before the election, and as soon as the election's over, it's like, okay, ciao, and they go their own different way. And it's very difficult to form stable coalitions. And in the Italian context, where you have a very permissive electoral system, they've been toying with it for the past, say, 30 years. But the permissive electoral system has led to a great deal of instability in the political system because governments will fall, and because of the parliamentary system that isn't at routine, and it's possible for a government to fall and a new government to take its place either with or without a new election. It's complicated. But we should know that there are different ways of organizing political power. Whether or not Americans would ever agree to change their electoral system, and we have this fierce debate right now, among proponents of let's go to just a national vote. Take a vote, and whoever gets the most wins. And I think, coming to our current election, one thing that surprised me, I will just put out my cards, and I know we differ on this. I did not expect Trump to get the popular vote. I thought it was going to be something like it was in 2016, where that he was going to win the Electoral College, but not necessarily the popular vote. Trump won both this time, and that means, in my eyes, that for many Americans, it's considered a legitimate outcome because he did get the popular vote and he did get the Electoral College vote. But to answer the question, we should understand that there are many different ways of organizing elections and manufacturing different outcomes in terms of who is the winner. And we could say maybe the more straightforward the system, the more it's easy to understand. But every country is different. And another thing that matters as well is the size of the legislature. Some countries only have, say, 120 people in that legislature, 150 people in that legislature. Other countries will have many hundreds of people. And that matters for proportionality because you can't divide a seat. So sometimes larger parties are going to get a disproportionate share. And sometimes countries will try to reward the smaller parties. Other countries will reward the larger parties. Some countries will set a threshold and say you can't get legislative representation unless you get 5%. And Greece has a really high one, sometimes like 12%, 17%, just depends on the context. So there are different ways of organizing these elections and having, it'd be really interesting to take an electoral result and see how it would matter in the different types of systems to see who the winner would be, because it would differ based on the context.
That is fascinating. So now it's a follow-up in part to that, but so when you spoke to, it's the last thing you get to, you've been going, you go to president, you go down ticket. So how do you understand the actual psychology of voting? What is motivating voters to vote the way they do? And then the follow-up to that is going to be, how do we predict what they're going to do?
In the American context,
Yes.
it is party identification that predicts.
Okay.
And so I think this election cycle certainly represents that very well, that Republicans vote for Republicans and Democrats vote for Democrats. There's a thing certainly that is that we call negative partisanship, that a lot of the times our elections are now not only determined by you wanting to vote for your own party, but the disdain that you hold for the opposition party. And that really drives people to the poll. I think that's a fundamental sort of feature of our American sort of political psychology. A thing that if I was a Democrat that I'd be very, very concerned about, especially when it comes to Gen Z, and I'm using this as because we're on a college campus, is the proportion of men, Gen Zers, who voted for Republicans. Because voting is habitual, and the best predictor of how you're going to vote 4 years from now is the party in which you voted for today. And that is something, I think, a trend. It's one thing, no offense to members of Gen Z, your turnout rates are not as high as older Americans, but you're eventually going to get old. You will get old. It happens to all of us. And when you get old, you will really be excited about turning out to vote. You'll be excited about a whole bunch of things that you never thought you would be, like gardening and paint, anyway. But it's happening. And I think that is a really important thing. We're talking about the psychology of voters. Mm-hmm. Party identification, the way that you feel about the opposition party, and that voting is habitual. And so if you really want to change the trends of American political life, you have to start young. And I don't, I'd like to, I'll be interested to see over the next 4 years what that investment in young voters look like. I hope that was what you were looking for.
I mean, so on the question of psychology, I wonder, I mean, I think of psychology as like, what's going on in people's heads, right?
Not necessarily yes,
Yeah.
but it sounds like you might be assuming conscious. I'm not making that assumption.
Well, no, I just mean
Like what they would articulate,
in
not
order
necessarily-
to
not-
think
yeah.
about voter behavior, right? I mean, we also need to think about like the environments that people are in, right?
Sure.
So like, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about in the last few days is how different facts will be salient to you as a voter depending on the sort of the physical environment that you live in, the information environment that you live in, your social connections, right? So if you're the person who's going, I mean, so consider like two bits of economic news, right? So one bit of economic news is the good news that, hey, there's a bunch of job opportunities opening up if you're willing to relocate. Good news, right? Bad news, and this is hypothetical, right? So bad news, prices are going up, right? So an economist looks at this and says, hey, there's good news and there's bad news, right? But most people are not actually looking for jobs most of the time. Some people are, of course, and they'll notice that, hey, there's a bunch of jobs, right? But most people are going to the grocery store on a weekly basis and noticing that prices are going up, right? So some facts about how the economy is doing are going to be really salient to people, and some facts are not necessarily going to be. And I think this is true, and I think you can come up with lots of cases about how this works, right? And I think in order to understand why people are voting the way that they are, like you have to take into account like the specifics of the world that people are living in, right?
Can I respond to this as well?
Please.
I think that also, and this is something that's really difficult to understand, but so much of what's happening in today's politics is based on feelings, right? And the way that people are evaluating political information. Now, here we are on a university campus. Everyone is learning. If you're a student, you're in classes, you're debating different theories, you're learning how to be critical, you're learning how to analyze information in a particular way. Other people who haven't gone through this process, they hear particular facts, and that's an interesting word too, because facts will be interpreted in different ways. But I think that the psychology of it is that we have to get to something that is really difficult to empirically assess, and that's how the different conditions within the country and the different things that are happening make people feel. And I think that Trump and the Republican Party have really understood that very well, and just that feelings are so important in this way. And I think that until we get a grip on that, we're not going to fully understand this whole picture.
So I'll ask a different version of the question, because you don't have to follow the news, follow the electoral news much to know that polls are just they come out constantly, or at least they seem, from my perspective, they just seem there's every 3 days there's a poll that overturns the poll from 2 days before. And so because part of what it's saying is how do we predict, maybe it's not who someone's going to vote for, because maybe that's assuming they're voting, what's explaining which circle they fill in or lever they pull down. But if polls have any value, right, they're supposed to be predicting something that otherwise we can't, right? It's not like you just, because then we would just read the party rolls and then we would know how everyone's voting. So what are polls, and what is their role in this whole
So first of all, polls do have value, and I say that not only because that's the reason I get a salary here from UMBC, but first and foremost, I think that oftentimes we're conflating. I have a really long answer. I'm going to try to okay. I think a lot of times we conflate public opinion polling with just the horse race. That we should just who's up, who's down, and that's the most important thing that public opinion polls does. That is patently incorrect. I think what makes public opinion polling so great, and it speaks to this idea of legitimacy, that public opinion polls give an opportunity for everyday average citizens to weigh in on exactly what their government is doing and have their opinions heard. My bread and butter has always been doing polls in Maryland, doing polls on statewide issues that perhaps would never get any attention on any of the national polls. And I think it's very important that we continuously check in with Marylanders and American citizens, who are the population of interest, which is the word we would use for that we always use as pollsters, on their opinions on what's going on, how their government is doing, how their governor is doing, what the state legislature is doing. This is all really important. It's not just the voices of activists who show up who matter. It doesn't, and it's not, and for the people who have the time to write their councilman or to show up at a state legislative hearing. Those are all important functions of civics and a democracy, but not everybody has the time to do that. And I think public opinion polls, if done correctly, taking a random sample of whatever the population is, gives everyday citizens a chance to weigh in on what's going on. That being said, of course, during election times, we want to know who's up and who's down. I guess my follow-up question to the idea of like, why polls? What does it look like in a world without public opinion polls? Is it really better for you? Then who gets to decide who's up or who's down? Who gets to tell you what policies are popular or unpopular? Pundits? Political operatives? Because in the absence of giving citizens and residents a voice themselves, of allowing them scientifically to speak with that voice, it's just politicos and operatives in media. At least it's a data point that shows. That being said, it's a science, but it's an imperfect science because people are imperfect individuals who sometimes have attitudes that are all across the board and make no sense. It happens.
Sure.
When we look at the polls, though, so Carolyn mentioned how I wasn't surprised. I frankly wasn't surprised at the outcome because it was always a possibility. Almost every single poll from the crucial swing states, as well as the polls that showed the national vote, showed both Trump and Harris, oftentimes either statistically tied within the margin of error of each other, which means things could break any way. And if you think about the blue wall states and you think about the composition of what each of those electorates look like regarding gender, race, age, educational attainment, it is not surprising that if you lose one, you also lose the other ones because the people who live in those states look an awful lot like, even just demographically, but also culturally, like the other Midwestern states. And so that's my big poll answer from a pollster who has obvious bias towards loving polls.
Both for me personally, because it would help a lot, and I think I might not be alone. What does margin of error mean? Like when I hear that, what is it? What's it supposed to ring in my head? Because it just says to me like, no, this is the.
Well, I'm not going to get. I will use my. I have a couple really fun polling anecdotes to talk about this, but the reason that public opinion polling works. In the most simplest terms, is everybody has an equal probability of getting selected because almost everybody in the US has a cell phone or a landline. Landlines are dying off slowly. In about probably 5 or 6 years, I'm going to stop calling landlines altogether. But because you have an equal probability of getting selected, I can apply basic probability theory to you. The margin of error basically means if I conducted the poll 95 out of 100 times, that the result that I get, Trump 51, Harris 48, will have a plus or minus on either end, like 3%. That's about, like if you have anywhere between 800 and 1,000 completed interviews, that's why you always see that with polls. That's a standard number because it gives you a plus or minus of 3%. And so that means it can be anywhere as high as like 51, 52, 53, 54, or as low as 50, 49, 48. So the only way that you can say that somebody is ahead is if they are actually outside of the margin of error. It drives me bananas when I see people say, oh, they have a 1-point lead. No, they do not. They do not have a 1-point lead. But here in Maryland, so we had our senatorial contest between Angela Alsobrooks, the Democratic nominee, and Larry Hogan, the Republican nominee. Eventually, she had a lead outside of the margin of error. So we had about a 9-point difference between Hogan and Alsobrooks, and it shook out that there's going to be about a 7-point difference. which is pretty, you know. But keeping in mind, I think I will leave you with one more thing. It's not just margin of error, it's understanding that polls are snapshots in time, that they are not crystal balls. Everybody wants to get really mad at pollsters. Like, I caught a lot of heat back in May when I did a poll between Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone. I had Trone above Alsobrooks, and I think that anybody paying attention to that race and the amount of money spent by David Trone as a candidate, and the fact that Alsobrooks really smartly, by the way, sat on the majority of her campaign cash until the last few weeks. I think Trone was leading that election way up until maybe 4 weeks out, where she really put a lot more effort, a lot more, not effort, but spending in. And so I guess that's, polls are snapshots, think about the margin.
I think if they say that something's within the margin of error, it's really close.
Yes.
It's really close, and they're basically saying, and I think that the polls in this election were correct because they were really close. All of those swing states, 1 point, 0.2, 2 points, that meant that either one of them, it's the sample. Like we were talking about samples earlier. I have this thing for M&Ms, so it's like I always talk about M&Ms. But if you take like a big bowl of all the different color M&Ms and you take a handful of those M&Ms, you have a sample in your hand. How much does that sample in your hand match what's in the bowl? Right, and you were using the soup.
I have a soup in blood. I have the blood example too. If you don't believe in random sampling, next time you go to the doctor's office, just have them take it all.
Yeah, exactly. But
it's a good one. Come on.
So for my
but the point is that there are going to be slight deviations from the sample to the whole. And when we say that something is within the margin of error, what we're saying is that the two choices are so close to each other that either one of them could be ahead of the other. And when they say that they're not within the margin of error, the distance between them is so great so that even if this one came back 3 and this one went up 3, they still would be in their relative positions. So that's what I think that means.
And I want to say one thing, because if you have been paying a lot close attention, you're going to be like, but what about Iowa? What about the famed Seltzer poll that was off? When we're talking about the 95% confidence interval, that means 5% of the time, things can be a hot mess. And I would unfortunately say that, that this time around, although she has an incredible track record, the sample that she drew just did not represent Iowa at that point in time. It happens. I hope it does not happen to me. But it happens to the very, very best of the people in the business.
That's right.
So just one last thing that is sort of generic, just for each of you. If you were to say, like, what are your main takeaways from Tuesday, maybe with like a slightly forward-looking bent to it, and then we'll transition to the Q&A.
I think I'm probably more backward. I think I have more to say backward-looking than forward-looking.
Do what you feel.
So I've been trying to think about the election and Trump's Republican Party in a sort of broader historical context, basically. And so maybe it'll be a different way of thinking about what's happening. So a curious thing about our two parties that's different than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago is that if you're the kind of person who thinks that our institutions are working pretty well and we should engage maybe in some piecemeal reform, but basically our institutions are legitimate and things are working okay and worth preserving, then you're probably a Democrat. And if you're the kind of person who has what I would describe as a more radical view, actually, in a certain sense, I mean, the idea that the institutions are working pretty well and we shouldn't mess with them because they contain the wisdom of the ages, that's basically a conservative idea in the classical sense, right? And I think Trump and Trump's Republican Party, I mean, he's ready to sort of tear down the existing institutional order. He promises to sort of tear it down and replace it with something completely different, which is a radical politics, basically, right? And so I've been thinking about, like, what are the conditions under which a radical politics like that becomes like possible, basically, right? And so I think in order to understand, like, why are people drawn to a political movement that says, let's just tear everything down. It's all rotten, right? Let's just get rid of it and build something new. I think the answer to that is complicated. But here's what I would say. So a couple old philosophers, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, both argued in different ways that if you see major political changes happening, you should look for underlying economic structural changes that explain what's happening at the political level. Yeah? I think there's something to that idea, and that's at least part of the story here. So what I would suggest is that the Republican Party of George Bush and Mitt Romney, sort of the traditional Republican Party, and also the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and all these people, have sort of presided over some very fundamental economic changes in our country over the last 40 or 50 years, right? And I'm thinking in particular about like major deindustrialization and then the reconfiguration of the economy that sort of working people face, right? And I think what's happened, what I would suggest anyway, as an interpretation of what's happening, is that sort of working people have sort of lost faith or belief in the legitimacy of the traditional political parties, right? And the traditional institutional status quo. Because of these underlying economic changes that have had sort of disparate impacts in different places around the country, right? And then that sort of creates what you could think of as a legitimacy crisis, where there's not legitimate, right? There's a kind of vacuum of legitimate institutions. And then it becomes possible for somebody like Trump to sort of sweep in and say, hey, I'm just going to blow it all up, right? People become open to that kind of message under conditions in which there's a sort of a legitimacy vacuum, basically, right? And so that's one way of trying to make sense of our politics, right, of what's happening right now. And the way that the parties have really reconfigured themselves. I mean, in particular, the Republican Party is almost unrecognizable from what it was 15 or 20 years ago, right? And is doing a different kind of politics entirely. So I guess that's a thought anyway.
What's the takeaway from the election? I think the country's going to change. And I don't know exactly how. But then is it also possible that President-elect Trump will not knock it all? I don't know. We will have to see. I mean, we know what he says. His own people say that he tends to be hyperbolic. So, I mean, do we take what he says at face value, or do we wait and see? Yeah. And I will say that I don't know. I don't even think that the people who support him know exactly what he's going to do, but somehow they trust him. And, we're going to have to see what happens. The states, there's, with the abortion debate, there's been a lot of attention to states' rights. Is it possible that states will be given more capacity to make decisions for themselves? And our federalism will have a patchwork of laws across the country, making things even more complicated. We need to have another one of these in a year and see.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Let's see what happens. But I think it would be. We have to wait and see.
I guess my takeaway message, especially speaking to an audience here on a university campus, is to really recognize that we as people silo ourselves with like-minded individuals a lot and share only those sorts of conversation partners. So in that way, I guess I can understand why some people were so shocked that this happened. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and I wasn't shocked at all. But I think it's also because I have obviously the sort of university base, like my sort of friend network that's here, but I also have back home that's a really rural part of the country, and it's helped me, I think, really keep better perspective. Back to the polls really quickly. If a significant percentage of Americans continue to tell you that the country's not going in the right direction, if they continue to tell you that economic things like the cost of living is a key concern for them, you should listen to them if you're a lawmaker, because they're telling you something very, very clear. And I think that perhaps wasn't, although I think certainly the Harris campaign tried, there is certainly some messaging that could be tweaked and better, like certainly recalibrated, especially just focusing on the cost of groceries. I can't tell you how much that single issue made a big difference in places like Pennsylvania. When I drove home, I remember seeing a Trump-Harris sign. It said, Trump, price is low, Harris, price is high. And I thought to myself, there it is. There's Pennsylvania for you. And I think that resonated. I will say this, though, as a kind of, especially for Democrats who are really concerned, the federal government isn't the only government that matters. We have 50 states, and we have, I think particularly here in Maryland, I've always been impressed with our state legislature. They've tackled a lot of issues, and they've done a lot of things that have really improved the quality of life of Marylanders. Every time I go for a walk in a state park, I'm thankful that the Maryland General Assembly, who, by the way, oftentimes agree across party lines on some of these issues, on funding. There's obviously disagreement, but there is sometimes where they'll kind of come together for these types of issues. And it makes me glad to have a functional state government. I don't think anybody could say that the Maryland state government isn't functional. So when you think about democracy broadly, and yes, there looks like there's a lot of dysfunction going on at the highest levels, I think it's important to sometimes look towards your local leaders and look to the states, at least your state legislatures. They're all doing really important work on behalf of the people, and I think that's something, at least a good thing to hang your hat on, I suppose.
And if you're a young person and you want to make a difference, get involved. Get involved. I'm looking out at this audience and I see future leaders everywhere. Get involved. And find out how you could start at the local level and learn how it all works. And exactly as Malia said, at local levels of governance, there aren't usually these really intense, fierce, ideological debates, because we're all living together in the same community. We know each other, there's trust. And I would encourage all of you in some small way to get involved with something.
So, Carolyn, you said your favorite quote from politics earlier was about the counting votes.
Sure.
Mine is, there is not a Democratic or Republican way to fill a pothole. And that's why I always, and that's at least the takeaway, even though I think there's a lot of issues that are going on even at state governments. I try to remember that at the very base level, I think government should be at least doing these services for the people. And I will leave it at that.
All right, well, thank you. So I think that's as good a point as any to transition. We'll take just a very short, maybe 2-minute break if people want to submit their questions, and then we'll get into it. Or are we
Ready to go?
we're ready. Never mind.
Okay.
We're going to jump right into it. But you can keep submitting if you want. Lots of questions. Okay.
I started my classes.
Jessica, I don't think your mic's on. No,
Does this mic work?
that mic does.
I was all prepared for Professor Pfeiffer to go first. Hold on.
I can scream really loudly.
Go for it.
Can you all hear me?
So,
Yeah.
So I can be very loud. So we have a number of questions about the political split and what's the root causes Is it cultural? Is it economic? Is it moral? Does it have to do with facts? What is the split? And relatedly, and I'm just going to put these two together, how might we, because I think they're connected, how might we repair political discourse? I think they're somewhat related questions, so I'm going to pose both of them together. Did you all hear me okay? Yeah.
Excellent. Good
I'm
question.
looking to the philosopher.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I already sort of spoke a little bit about what I take to be some underlying economic factors that at least are driving a certain strand of partisan voters, right? But I mean, we certainly have to think about things like new media and media echo chambers. I guess I'd point out that like partisanship makes a lot of money for a lot of people. It makes a lot of money for news organizations. I think political parties themselves have figured out that negative partisanship is a really, really powerful way to move people, right? So I see a lot of kind of structural incentives for media institutions, political institutions to sort of reinforce our partisanship. And I don't see much incentive in, I mean, right? Because partisanship, like partisan outrage gets you more clicks, right? Or it gets you more followers in social media or whatever, gets you more votes, right? So I don't know where what are the incentive structures in our existing sort of political economy that push against that, right? I don't know what they are. It seems to me that we need to figure out how to change the incentives that institutions are providing, right? So that's one thought, anyway.
I have two things. One is that I am a capitalist, okay? So I very strongly believe in the free market, but not for everything, not for everything. And we have commodified so much, including our media, which means that exactly as you said, that as soon as you start clicking on a certain number of types of things that somehow interest you because of your feelings, like you click it because you like it. Now all of a sudden algorithms are giving you more and more and more of exactly that and never showing you an opposition point of view. And I think that is some of this. I also think it's really interesting that in the aftermath of the election, during the exit polls, and by the way, we have one. We have a UMBC exit poll that, look in the Baltimore Sun in the next, I don't know exactly when it's going to be released, but UMBC students were out there doing exit polling and asking voters important questions about their motivations and things like that. It's fascinating to me that during the day of the election, a lot of people were saying democracy is why I'm casting my vote. And I think that there was an assumption that if democracy was your key issue, you were going to vote for the Democrats. But it's fascinating to me that it goes both ways, that the Democrats see the Republicans as a threat to democracy, but equally so, the Republicans see the Democrats as a threat to democracy. So just by saying democracy, you don't understand and I think there was an assumption that that was only one way, right? And I guess the same thing would be true for abortion. Because you might, I think the country is split on these particular issues. So it's not like there are one or two driving issues dividing our public, but it is our reality, and it's a very hard reality, is that we are extremely polarized, and we have to find a way to talk to each other. And I take your point very much that, we need to learn how to have more difficult conversations with people who disagree with us, even if it's hard to do that. It's so much easier to be with people who agree with you, because then you can kind of like have your righteous indignation. But, then if you're hearing an opposite point of view, rather than, you remember that they're your colleague, your friend, they're your fellow American. I would love to go back to be in a world where we could have differing opinions without so much vitriol in our national discourse. So I don't think it was one thing that drove this election, but I do think it's fascinating that the things that people did say, both sides are blaming each other. And I don't know if that's going to, I think we'll continue to be driven apart as we get there. And another very important thing that we have, maybe I think Mike might have said something about this, but our income inequality it's big and it's growing and it's squeezing our middle class. And when you have a country that has a very stressed out middle class, that is not good for democracy. And we have to fix that problem. I'm not exactly sure how, but we have been watching income inequality between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans grow over the years, and we've reached a point now where we live in different ways. It's, what is the American way of life? I'm not sure I can define that now. So that's what I would say in response to this question.
I read a book a few years ago called The Big Sort, and I always thought it was, thought it was a really important book. It talked about how mobility of Americans allowed people to better sort themselves into like-minded individuals with like-minded neighborhoods. And I think that's certainly happening. If you look at the actual distribution of votes, you see pockets of really red, pockets of really blue. And you can see it even at the county level, this has happened. And what's happened, it creates people in like sort of information silos and cultural silos. One of the things that that my family from Western Pennsylvania, where I grew up, thinks is absolutely, completely nuts is when they hear about banning handguns. Like that was a conversation a few years ago, or putting additional restrictions on hunting rifles. It sounds absolutely insane culturally in a place where I got the first day of buck season off every single year in elementary and high school. So you can imagine how different that sounds and how crazy that sounds in these different sort of cultural configurations. And I think that does drive a lot of our politics. I bet if you lined up a bunch of individuals and looked at the different cars they drove, you could go down the line and say progressive, a conservative. The same way with people dress, the same with even the decor. There's some psychologists who found out, or psychologists, that the decor that people pick for their homes and even their dorm rooms, they actually did the study on college students. They could identify the political leanings by the type of decor that were put up in their rooms. And so these kind of cultural things I think really, really do matter. And the more we silo ourselves, and the media is absolutely to blame for this as well, because we used to get the sources from 5 or 6 different places, and now it's just things that make me feel good with people who make me feel better about it.
I think I would just add just very briefly, and I think plays at least some role, and it picks up on some of the themes, is a big change over the last 30 years is we have lost an external unifying enemy, right? So like the threats to democracy are seen to be internal, where for a long period it was viewed as, okay, we understand that the most immediate existential threats to democracy, our way of life, are external. When that was coming out of the Cold War, there was a less awareness of what would happen as a result of not having an external unifying enemy to allow those energies to sort of get displaced outwards. So Professor Nance looks back to 19th century Germany, they look all the way back to Roman Republic, transition empire, and when Rome finally defeated Carthage in 146 at the end of the Third Punic War, there was no opposition to them. They just rolled across the Eastern Mediterranean, and that they started speaking about internally the way they used to speak about Carthage, and it just sort of, and then the massive increase in material wealth, disproportionately distributed, just tore it asunder, and they remade it in a different way. And so I think that's been, I haven't heard that talked about as much, and I do think it plays a pivotal role where it's threats are out there, and if you can't find them clearly out there, they got to be more hidden internally.
By the way, one thing that makes me think of our foreign policy. It's possible the fact, I don't know if the House has been called yet, but the fact that all of our institutions may be of one ideological leaning now, the foreign policy priorities that we've had are probably going to shift.
Yep.
I think it was working.
It's working.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I also want to draw together several questions that were asked along a particular theme, and that theme is information, disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. So one question, which I think is more of an empirical question, is was the misinformation and propaganda worse this election cycle than it has been in the past? A second related question is, if voters are making decisions at the polls based on misinformation, disinformation, or some form of propaganda, does that affect the legitimacy of the election? And then a third related question is, what duties do citizens have to ensure that they're voting according to good information? So there's the empirical question, the legitimacy question, and the duty question.
Anybody? I mean, I think it's in part the commodification of the media. I also think it's also the responsibility each of us feel to inform ourselves about not only the opinion that makes us think it's the right opinion, but what does the other side have to say? What are the different points of view? It's partially our fault that, you know, if you're only listening to one type of news or you're always following the same. Also, too, we're now tending to follow personalities, not necessarily like networks or perspectives, but, you know, people will follow podcasts or the independent media complex, if you will. Like, people will follow people because they tend to agree with them. And if they're not going that extra step, and we're busy, maybe we're sidestepping all those, you know, we just make it easier for ourselves. But if we are only listening to one point of view all the time, we're not going to understand maybe what the truth really is. And that's a huge problem.
I mean, I could speak a little bit to the legitimacy question. I mean, I worry a little bit that if misinformation or disinformation in the information environment delegitimizes elections, then there just will not be any legitimate elections ever, right? So like, I went to a talk a couple of years ago. It was here at UMBC. Somebody was presenting on the media environment in the early in the early years of the American Republic, and it was totally toxic and filled with, like, we have this weird idea that, like, people used to be, like, nice or something, or gentlemanly, I don't know, right? So newspapers, like, just published they were all partisan, and they published outrageous lies about other people, and so there's tons of misinformation in the media environment, right? And I just kind of worry that, like, I mean, if you have a free media, there's gonna be misinformation out there. So I think it can't be a legitimacy criterion, right? Yeah. That elections should take place only under, like, perfect informational conditions, right? Because then there will never be legitimate elections.
Yeah,
right?
that seems like a very bad precondition for legitimacy.
Yeah. I mean, it's not great. I mean, that's not to say I'm defending misinformation or anything, right? I'm just saying, like, I don't think we can say that that's a reason to sort of, like, toss out electoral results, right?
You wanted to say something?
Yes, I think Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who wrote a pamphlet on propaganda in the late 20s. I think on this misinformation, the title of it is propaganda, so the panel's probably all aware of that. Bernays basically said that public opinion is easily persuaded by envy, acquisitiveness, the need to acquire things, and fear. And that's what we see. I actually have to agree. It's like there's no period in history the propaganda. It just, it's more ubiquitous today because it's instantaneous, it's right in front of us. We get it in our sleep, whether we want to get it or not. Ting, right, notification.
So I perhaps wonder if that's why something as real as the cost of groceries really impacted people so much, because there really wasn't any disinformation around that. You know, you can walk into the grocery store and you were charged a specific price for goods that you knew were were less expensive like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And so like in the absence of, I think maybe our confusion and maybe like the different competing information sources that maybe the average voter doesn't know what to believe, there was some really concrete economic evidence right in front of folks. And I sincerely believe that, and I don't discount all the other things that went on in this election, but I sincerely believe the pocketbook cost of everyday issues really drove a lot of people, what we would call like low propensity voters. So the folks who maybe don't turn out to vote that often or really maybe don't participate that much in elections. I think that they saw that, and I think that it looked completely different to any information they were receiving anywhere else, but this was something that was concrete and right in front of them, and it really mattered. That's my own take. I don't know if that's true or not.
Sounds very plausible to me.
We have a gentleman.
We have.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so we've got a number of people asking questions related to why the shift has happened. So this revolutionary shift or these major changes are happening in this country, leaning so far to the right, but also worldwide. Like, why is that happening? One person also asked, is it the abandonment of the New Deal politics in this country? What is it that has led to this shift, this radical shift, but why has it gone to the right in the US and across the world? Why has it shifted so far to the right?
You want to go first?
Anybody? Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard question to answer because you do see, I mean, certainly it's not just the case that the far right has gained a lot of power in the United States. I mean, it's happening in, Germany is another country that is a country that I'm quite familiar with because I lived there for a while. And I mean, it's different there because obviously their internal politics are different than ours. But I mean, basically the AfD, which is the sort of far right party there, is also starting to win elections and is gonna, at some point, right? They're gonna get major political power if the trends continue, right? And insofar as, I mean, it's such a complicated question of comparative politics. I mean, I guess my starting hypothesis would be to look at similar structural economic changes. I mean, this sort of goes back to what I was saying about, the economic approach to historical and political change. That's where I would start if I was going to try to explain why these sort of parallel things are happening in different countries around the world, because similar underlying sort of economic restructuring processes are taking place. But I mean, that's just the hypothesis. There are other stories, certainly other stories you could tell, so I don't know what the answer is.
I think that's exactly right. I think there are multiple causes here, but I think a big one is that people feel that their traditional way of life is being compromised.
Yeah.
And we do see this, we see this in so many countries around the world, that people are gravitating to strong authoritarian practices that appeal to them. And in political science, we have perspectives that say in any population, about a third of people naturally gravitate towards an authoritarian option, that they don't like openness and change. And I think that the fact that we've been going through a process of globalization and people are moving and cultures are changing, I think some people are very uncomfortable with that. And I'm sorry if this is a controversial statement, but I think people are uncomfortable with it, and they naturally gravitate to the leaders who, seem to represent something from the past, perhaps. And, but again, I totally agree with your assessment. This is very multi-causal. There is no one arrow that's going to explain everything.
Yeah, I think one very difficult question that is maybe unanswerable is what, and this doesn't just speak to, global rightward shift, but just, is there a fundamental shift in people and their attitudes or expressions of attitudes that have been there more, you hear them, you see them, and both of those can be true, right? There could be actual genuine changes in people's attitudes. Because I think one thing that's undeniably, seems to have happened, especially in the last 20 years, especially with the rise of social media, is you feel like you're instantly connected to the world, and there's been with that a feeling actually almost like alienation among the people who are right around you. And this has come up a couple of times. Like, it's really hard to get, it's really easy to get really angry with the people you live with, right? But like to take it to a level where you speak in ways and you don't have to worry about the consequences, the effects of that have made it so you can express, and this, I don't think this speaks to, this is across the spectrum, the ease with which you can consequence-free almost say things at a very high pitch, because it's not to someone who's like sitting right next to you or like down the street or around the way. It's like, it's almost as if to the void, because it's, you post it on it and it just gets like zoomed out. I think the effects of that have created a sense of alienation that have like led people to be more vitriolic in their expressions, and then they've, that has a sort of reinforcing effect where a flag gets like raised up the flagpole and people kind of gravitate towards that. And so, when 1,000 years from now, when historians, it's not a quote, but it's just something I thought, it's like two of the biggest facts is it took about 200,000 years of human evolution to get to 1 billion people and 100 to get to 7. That fact alone is going to be massively explaining like so much of what we've seen over the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years. And then the original idea of Facebook, connect everyone. When I first heard that, I was like, that's a bad idea. Everybody needs human connection. Everyone needs not to be connected to everybody else, because it turns everybody into a mob. Having actual distance is necessary to not rise everything immediately up to a level. And, that's just one of the effects. Those are some of the effects that I think we're seeing.
And I think the rate of change is going to accelerate.
Yeah,
And Neil deGrasse Tyson said, like, if you compare somebody who lived a really long time ago to someone who lived like 100 years after that, there was not a lot of change between how they lived. And then you go forward another couple hundred years, there's probably not a lot of change. But if you compare how we live to when just even 30 years ago, 60, if you just go back by 30-year increments, the way that people lived radically changed. And he predicted that with everything that's happening, it's not going to be another 30 years, it's going to be another 15, and then another 15, and then perhaps that's going to go to 7. He was like, it's kind of like going like this. And so, the way, just think about it, the way that we live right now is radically different than just 30 years ago compared to 30 years before that. And that for, some folks, I still don't know how to use my tablet. It's like, it's, not everybody is going to be able to, and some people don't want that change, even though it's coming.
I always think a really winning issue for older Americans, if somebody would run on getting rid of the self-scanners at every single grocery store, my mother would be 100% ready to vote for that candidate. Speaking of change. Then that's just a larger commentary on automation that is certainly coming. And definitely to your point, that the increase of AI and automation for everything will dramatically change our economy. And there's going to be a lot of pushback against it, like there is with my mother at CVS.
I heard a comedian once say, like, I don't work here, right? So, do I get a discount on my groceries if I self-checkout? Because I'm doing the work.
It's been factored in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from a young voter who feels like both parties don't look for long-term solutions to issues. They're only looking 4 years ahead. this question is followed up with, this is right, I'm not crazy.
You are not, no.
And you're
you
not
are
crazy. And I wanted to sort of add, if I could, a spin onto this question about long-term problems like the problem of climate change and other environmental problems and energy issues like nuclear waste storage and things like that. How are we supposed to think about the election cycle and long-term issues that are especially going to hit hard for the people in the room who are under 25?
I mean, I think this is is a great question. It's one of the great puzzles of institutional design is trying to figure out how to design institutions that have that kind of timeline, right? Because of course politicians are only going to think about the next 4 years, right?
That's a long time. 4 years is a long time.
4 years, yeah, probably not 4
long
years, right? I mean, the system is set up so that they only think about what they need to do in the near term in order to get reelected, right? And similarly with economic institutions, yeah?
Well, I think what this question does, it kind of really, it goes back to Carolyn's very first answer to the very first question, is that if you know you're going to have power 50 years from now, you can take a 50-year view. But if regularly you're going to have to try to re-get power, you can only take a view that will motivate people to put you in power. Now, part of the problem is give somebody power for 50 years.
Please don't say we don't need to have another election for 50 years.
No, this speaks to the fundamental, a fundamental problem.
Yeah,
people have shown over and over and over and over, given that kind of job security, they will abuse it. And it's that trade-off between, as I think Carolyn put it well, democracy at its most fundamental level is at regular intervals, you can get the rascals out. And a cost of that is the time horizon is much shorter than if somebody or some group knows they'll be in power in perpetuity. And there's no real way, or there might be ways to incentivize short-term, medium-term, long-term envisioning, but I mean, some things, not having people allowed to be reelected and have longer terms, is one that those, But I think that question puts its finger on it. I just wanted to, about human organization, human political organization.
So I listen for the climate change issue, and you're talking about looking at what young people look and they see climate change as this really big issue, obviously, and that neither party is addressing it, and the issue of short-term and long-term come into play. I guess my question is, even if you certainly recognize the detrimental effects of climate change, are you ready to ask a community that has already been a victim of deindustrialization? Coal mines have moved out, back home in Western Pennsylvania, there's no coal minings left. Are you going to tell people who live in my hometown, I'm sorry, no more hydraulic fracturing, I know that's your way of life and I know that's how you put food on the table. That is the problem with sometimes the long term and short term, because somebody has to give up something in the short term, and oftentimes what they give up is an economic way of life, and it is difficult. Those transitions are difficult, and I think it's important to recognize them as well. Although obviously there's a big broader issue with climate change that will affect all of us, and climate change certainly affects disproportionately poorer communities more than richer communities, and that's true as well. But for every single policy that's good for the long run, there is some short-term issues that you have to find a way to address if you ever want to get to the point where you're adopting policy that helps in the long term for everybody. We have time.
So we're going to have one last question. It's a group of questions, a number of people, and I'm sorry we can't get to everyone's questions. I know there's a lot, but a number of people have expressed fear, and the correlate to that is what can you say to offer hope, and what can we do?
Notice we're quiet. I feel a little bit better today than I did yesterday. I'll put that out there. I think the initial shock of it, I will confess, I was shocked. I walked into my classroom yesterday. My students, it was a very somber moment for all of us. And well, the ray of hope is that we are a democracy, and hopefully we can keep it. Hopefully it will stay that way. Hopefully we will, I do worry about issues like climate change because of the political profile of the folks who are now in power, who don't see it as a very salient issue. And exactly as Malia said, we have short-term costs and long-term costs. And you know what came to my mind? We need Taylor Swift and Joe Rogan to talk about climate change. I
mean, so I guess what I would say, I'm not a naturally optimistic or hopeful person. I'm gonna be completely honest with you, right? So I'm like the worst person to really address that question. But so here's what I would say is we're living in a time of a great deal of social upheaval, and that's scary because it opens up the possibility of unknown bad things happening, or maybe foreseeable bad things happening as well. But social upheaval and institutional change also opens up other kinds of possibilities that maybe we can't see right now, right? I think that's what I would say.
I'm going to repeat something I said before. Young people, get involved. Get involved.
To that point, we are all in this together.
Yes.
Thank you, Ryan.
I mean, yeah, it's very difficult because we are in this moment with everyone. I mean, for me personally, one thing that helps me a lot is talking to people, doing the things that really matter to you and investing your time in that. And for me, very personally, reading a lot of history, like reading a lot about other cultures, other times, because part of the human condition is like you exist at the forefront of all of history is behind you, right? You're at the forefront, and it's almost inevitable. And once you start, people have always thought that they live at the most crucial time there ever was, and sometimes they were right-ish, sometimes they were wrong-ish, right? And so it's at least a way to view yourself as sort of rooted in this tradition that goes way back behind you. And that doesn't mean there's not things that need to be done and things that you need to do to change and things you have to face, but it can help to give you the space to breathe deeply, to say like, it does feel like, this is the most important time there's ever been. But you don't have to go too far back to have people expressing that exact idea at times where you look back on it and you're like, I would trade that spot for right now. Now, of course, there's spots you wouldn't, and that, for me at least, is helpful. Like, look forward by really rooting that direction in an understanding of the past.
That's good. We have to end on an
I think
optimistic
it's a very
message.
good note to end on. Very good.